Good morning. Everybody's head pops up. It's kind of like you're all little gophers. I am pleased to present Olivia Gallucci, who will be your next speaker. She is an offensive security engineer, freelance penetration tester, and security researcher. She is an undergrad student at the Rochester Institute of Technology, double majoring in cybersecurity and computer science, and minoring in free and open source software and freedom culture, and ranks in the top 1% of her class. In addition, Olivia maintains a blog on security, open source software, and productivity. Outside of cybersecurity, she enjoys competitive sailing, political debates clubs, and biographies of famous computer nerds. Welcome, Olivia.
All right, so hi everyone. Welcome to my talk on malicious and on exploit and malicious tool development utilizing open source software. So statements I make in any media that uses this disclaimer reflect my opinions and do not reflect the views or policies of my employers, past or present, or any organization that I might be affiliated with. Additionally, any names I mention or software I mention in this presentation are not associated with me or my employers either. I'm giving credit for their work. As a quick introduction, hi, my name is Olivia Gallucci. My background is primarily in the offensive security space. I started my career as a penetration testing consultant, and then I moved to corporate red teaming for around a year or so. I then switched to vulnerability research through a government contract with the Department of Homeland Security and CISA. And then over the past year, I've been doing freelance malicious tool development and software development. I got into freelance because it's common to only do a fraction of the attack and reporting process when hacking in consulting and corporate settings. I really enjoyed one aspect of this process, which is the focus of this talk. But my goal in freelance was to get better at every area of the attack and reporting process by doing every area of it myself. Also, I'm a student at RIT studying computing security and computer science. Now let's get into the talk. Offensive security exists to identify and mitigate vulnerabilities within systems by simulating real-world attacks to bolster defense strategies. The goal is for good hackers to find vulnerabilities before malicious attackers do. Since we know that cybercrime isn't going to stop anytime soon, understanding offensive development is critical to protect assets. So for this presentation, I'll be wording scenarios as an attacker because that's what my job is. The only difference is the end goal. Thus, when I say I'm trying to harm a system, remember I'm doing so with the intent of protecting it. Before we get any further, I also want to quickly define what I mean by open source, because I'm not talking about monetarily free or freedom-respecting software. So for background, what is free and open source software, or FOSS? The word free represents freedom as in free speech, not like free as in free of cost or free beer. In general, labeling a program as FOSS guarantees 4 freedoms: that the source code is open for anyone to use, study, share, and modify. FOSS is different from the term open source. Similar to the word natural on food packaging, open source is a vague term that does not guarantee any of the 4 freedoms. And for this presentation, I'm using an even broader definition of open source, which is to refer to all slightly readable software up to full-fledged freedom-respecting FOSS. This also includes open resources, for example, ExploitDB. So what are we talking about when we say exploit and malicious tool development, and what is their role within attacks? Well, it's all part of a process, and I think Casey John Ellis's example of getting punched in the face illustrates security vocabulary well in this context. When getting punched in the face, we know that the threat is the punch being thrown. The threat actor is the person who wants to punch you in the face. The attack surface is the size and shape of your face, while the risk is the likelihood of getting punched in the face plus the amount of damage caused if the punch lands. Here, the vulnerability is your inability to defend against the punch, and the exploit is the fist. In other words, the the vulnerability is the weakness and the exploit is the weapon that harnesses that weakness. So what exactly are exploits? Exploits can be synonymous with any weapon. It could be a fist, knife, gun, bat, car, or a plastic spoon. In this context, a weapon is a piece of code that takes advantage of a vulnerability to carry out a specific action. When the exploit is run or the fist is thrown, I can hopefully bypass security to gain unauthorized access or knock you down to steal your wallet. Vulnerabilities arise from various factors such as programming errors, misconfigurations, design flaws, or inadequate controls. So when we talk about exploit development, we're referring to studying those things to find or create harm. Now, you might be wondering, how does someone develop an exploit and how does it differ from standard vulnerability research? And what's that process like? One reason why I wanted to do this talk is because these terms have no formal definitions, and this is kind of terrible for people who are looking to buy and sell exploit-related services. Half the time, people don't know what I'm talking about, and the other half, I don't understand what they want from me. So in this talk, I want to explore what each of these roles are in my experience and encourage everyone to think about how we can define these terms to become more industry standard. Most commonly, exploit development starts with traditional vulnerability research, although some people just do the development part, which I'll get into in a bit. This research may be done through reverse engineering by analyzing software binaries or by feeding by analyzing software binaries or by fuzzing, which is feeding a program with massive amounts of random or unexpected data. It also includes code auditing by studying source code or dynamic analysis by monitoring the software's behavior during runtime. This also includes debugging and instrumentation as well. Instrumentation refers to the process of adding code to a program to monitor its behavior. This behavior could include like system calls, network traffic, memory access, and other functions of a program's execution. Lastly, it could include threat modeling. And this is usually done to understand the system's architecture. Now let's explore exploit development. As I previously stated, exploit development starts by identifying and understanding the vulnerabilities within software. This can be done through various means, including reverse engineering, code auditing, fuzzing, and other methods I mentioned in the previous slide. However, there's an edge case of vulnerability discovery, though, where engineers will literally create and push vulnerable code into an internal program that a corporation runs if they find the opportunity to do so. And I've seen this used as a way to prove that more coding tests and reviews need to be done throughout a company's or team's software development process. Then, once a vulnerability is identified, the next step is to develop a proof of concept to demonstrate its existence and impact. And this proof of concept can literally just be a proof of concept or something that they actually plan to use to harm a system. This typically involves writing a small piece of code or crafting input data that triggers the vulnerability. Let's dive into this subcategory for a bit. Exploit proofs of concepts are one of the best areas to see how open resources can be used. For example, ExploitDB is a website that provides a collection of exploits, shellcode, and vulnerable web apps and security reports. You can also download and add to it as well. I found it particularly helpful because of its ability to filter and just sort data. So if you want to sort by version number, program name, or even date, it's super easy to do and very easy to use. I've also seen people use CX Security. It's a blog maintained by one person, so I can't really verify all the things that are put on there, but I've seen people use it. Lastly, we have GitHub. I think everyone here knows how to use GitHub at this point, but I search GitHub a million times a day just to see if other people have done something before me and can save me a lot of time. Now we're turning to the exploit development process. After POC development, we designed the exploit to take advantage of the discovered vulnerability. This involves understanding the system's architecture, memory layout, and behavior to craft a payload that can exploit the vulnerability and achieve a desired outcome, such as gaining remote code execution, privilege escalation, or really any other thing that you'd want to do. Then we create the exploit's payload, which is the code or data that the exploit injects or executes on the target machine. Payloads are really cool, and one of my favorite activities in school was a rubber ducky payload workshop. A rubber ducky is a programmable USB which is used for keystroke injection attacks. And a payload, in this case, a great example of that is like disabling volume controls and rickrolling the user at maximum volume until they turn the machine off. There's tons of payload examples on GitHub. Like if you just search like payload, like the top one I think has like 20K stars, and then like the bottom one on the first page I think has like 11K stars. So like there's a ton that are very famous and very fun. Payloads can vary depending on the exploit's goals, such as spawning a shell, executing arbitrary commands, or establishing a backdoor for future access. Next, if we're lucky, we'll be able to test our exploits to ensure they work reliably. And this involves like debugging the exploit's code, tweaking parameters, or redefining the payload. However, this is often very hard to do, especially if you only have limited information or cannot easily replicate the environment you're trying to break into. And I will say debugging and testing is also one of the trickiest areas because you often only have one shot before something is flagged. And at least in my experience, this is especially true in low latency networks or networks that don't have much variety to the traffic that's being sent through them. Then we may focus on obfuscation and evasion to bypass security mechanisms such as like antivirus detection or like intrusion detection prevention systems, like all that type of stuff. We'll sometimes employ techniques such as like code obfuscation, and even like sometimes like trying to encrypt something, which doesn't always work in the grand scheme of things if we're trying to retrieve certain information, but that's one thing that's often done to just make the exploit harder to detect and analyze. Finally, we might document and share our research and learning with the security community. This is usually done through ExploitDB, Twitter, blogs, or presentations. This helps raise awareness about whatever we found and also enables defenders to develop countermeasures. Throughout the exploit development process, we almost always have a set of responsible disclosure practices, ensuring that vendors have an opportunity to patch the vulnerability before anything's shared, or if the vulnerability could potentially be exploited maliciously, that hopefully solves that problem too. Some exploit developers just focus on 3 to 4 areas of this process, though. For example, vulnerability discovery is often rooted out of these jobs because you can often pay people performing, automated scanning and automated scanning and triaging much less than a software developer. Now, how does exploit development differ from malicious tool development? While exploit development focuses on crafting code to exploit vulnerabilities, malicious tool development encompasses a wider range of functionalities aimed at facilitating various malicious activities, including but not limited to exploit development. There's 3 main aspects to this, which is frameworks, customs, and automation. Starting with frameworks, sometimes we'll use or create platforms that have a collection of pre-built exploits corresponding to vulnerabilities. These frameworks provide us with the ability to easily launch attacks against vulnerable systems without the need to develop these exploits ourselves. Some popular frameworks include Metasploit, Autosploit, Pacu, Routersploit, Beef, and WEF. Metasploit is one of the most widely and comprehensive exploit frameworks used. It offers a collection of exploits, payloads, auxiliary modules, and post-exploitation tools. Metasploit is often used in conjunction with ExploitDB as well. Autosploit automates the remote host exploitation by collecting targets from Shodan, Census, and ZoomEye with options for custom targets as well. It leverages selected Metasploit modules for remote code execution and back connections. It also offers a proxy edition where you can like modify settings and a custom user agent. So for some context, Shodan is a search engine specifically designed to find connected devices, and like including like computers, servers, cameras, printers, like really anything, by indexing information from banners and metadata. Census is a platform that helps discover, monitor, and analyze devices that are accessible from the internet just by regularly probing every public IP address and popular domain names. Lastly, ZoomEye is a search engine similar to Shodan, specifically focused on discovering and indexing internet-connected devices. These resources are mostly paid, though. So since this presentation focuses on open resources, I wanted to mention this tool called, I think it's called IVRA, like IVE or something. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it, but although I haven't done like a direct one-to-one comparison, it is technically an alternative to these options. Then we have Pacu, which is an AWS exploitation framework. Pacu allows users to exploit configuration flaws within an account using modules to expand its functionality. Current modules enable a range of attacks, including privilege escalation, backdooring users, and attacking vulnerable Lambda functions. Lambda functions refers to a serverless computing function that is hosted by AWS Lambda. Next, we have Routersploit. Routersploit is tailored for embedded devices, featuring modules for exploits, testing credentials, scanning vulnerabilities, and really just everything else. It's pretty comprehensive. And then next, we have Beef, which is a tool that's used to hijack web browsers, using them as a launching point for various attacks. It can manipulate browser content, request permissions for device access, execute code, and deceive the user into running malware. This tool provides limited control over a user's browsers, enabling actions like tab nabbing, which is where a tab redirects a user to like a fake login portal, and the user would then log in and you could capture their credentials. Lastly, we have WEF, which audits Wi-Fi networks with different types of attacks for WPA, WPA2, WPS, like pretty much all of it. And then it also helps with automated like cracking of passwords as well. And yeah. And then outside of these frameworks, we might create exploits tailored to specific vulnerabilities to target environments. These exploits are integrated into the malicious tool, and it also just helps us exploit something a little bit more efficiently. But again, this is occasionally rare, especially if you're doing it outside of like a corporate setting, because you often need something very specific in those settings. Whereas, at least for my experience in freelance, using something a little bit more general has often been very helpful, because it's usually just like found on the internet and it just works out of the box. In my experience, especially in like more of like corporate settings, this has been where I've like spent hours just reading like C or assembly code, modifying 1 to 2 lines, and then sending it off somewhere. However, I think SQL injection is more like one of the like more common examples of this, where people have developed customs. Let's say like there's a web application with known security vulnerabilities in it, is specifically like, let's say like the login portal is vulnerable to an SQL injection. We might create a custom exploit, specifically like a custom like SQL command that would allow us to bypass authentication and gain unauthorized access to the system. The custom exploit code would typically involve just constructing an SQL payload and then sending it to the vulnerable login form. The custom exploit, again, would be tailored to the specific vulnerability, and it wouldn't normally be something that you would be using generally. With the example of SQL injection, you're usually not getting like too specific, because like there's only like, you know, so many that you can do commonly. To get even more specific, the 2017 Equifax hack was a very famous example of this, where attackers utilized SQL injections as part of their attack strategy. They exploited a vulnerability in Apache software, which allowed them to execute SQL commands remotely on Equifax's web application. This vulnerability provided them with a foothold to access Equifax's systems, conduct reconnaissance, and ultimately exfiltrate sensitive data of 150 or so million Americans. Now back to malicious tool development. Lastly, we might try to automate the process to make it easier to launch attacks. And almost like all of the ones that we covered previously accomplish that goal, and you can find additional ones on GitHub too. Now, you might be wondering, where have there been problems in the past, especially from like specific open source tools? So back in the early 2000s, I believe it's Black Orifice, not back, I think that was a typo, was an open source remote administration tool for Windows, allowing control of the server from a distant client. It enabled functions from like file management to convert actions like keystroke logging. It also operated very stealthily, often escaping detection from antivirus. It was used for a variety of attacks, including one where the people who built this program accidentally distributed CDs with malware on them already, and so they did this at, I forget which DEF CON, but they distributed these CDs at DEF CON and then had to apologize for it because they didn't realize they had put malware on the CDs. The blame for its growth and popularity was really given to its creators, as well as Microsoft's lax security measures in Windows. This program really underscored the need to actually care about security in the early 2000s, especially just with how easy it was to upkeep and just keep embarrassing Microsoft. Metasploit is another common example that's caused harm. One prominent example of this is a 2012 zero-day Java exploit that targeted 2 previously unknown vulnerabilities, putting over 1 billion users at risk. The exploit was highly reliable and worked across multiple platforms and operating systems. At that time, Oracle claimed that over 3 billion users were running Java, and a significant portion of them were running Java 7, which was like very vulnerable to everything. And then prior to Oracle releasing patches, Metasploit just went and implemented this attack into Metasploit. And as a result, the people who had access to Metasploit could just like execute this attack on like wherever they wanted, and it caused a lot of harm, and it also was kind of a bad PR move for Metasploit because they were like, why did you do this? And then this instance really just illustrates how Metasploit's rapid dissemination of exploits can potentially aid attackers in compromising vulnerable systems, especially given that they did it before a patch was released. Lastly, we have Impacket. Impacket is an open source Python library that provides a set of tools for crafting and manipulating network protocols. It's widely used for network reconnaissance, exploitation, and post-exploitation activities. In 2021, Impacket was used by hackers to exploit several CVEs for various purposes, including gaining initial access, lateral movement, and network exploitation. These CVEs were leveraged by the hackers to install web shells and gain persistent access across a variety of victims' Microsoft Exchange servers. Additionally, Impacket was used for network exploitation activities, and the Impacket modules WMI exec and SMB exec were specifically used. These tools utilize Windows management instrumentation, that's what the WMI stands for, and then server message block, that's what the SMB stands for, to create semi-interactive shells with the target devices. Through these tools, the hackers were able to run commands on remote devices utilizing the required Windows management protocols. The use of Impacket allowed these attackers to compromise credentials, move laterally within the network, and ultimately just exfiltrate a lot of sensitive data from the victims' organizations. Additionally, a custom exfiltration tool named Covalent Stealer was employed to facilitate the exploitation of sensitive files on the victim's networks. Put simply, IMPacket just really served as it's pretty much the foundation for a lot of this attack at various points throughout the process, and it really just shows how one tool can really be used to just damage the reputation of a multitude of companies and really create a lot of harm. Through these examples, you can see there's a few instances where open source tools have proven to be problematic. However, it's important to remember that you can't fix bad systems without evaluating those systems. If malicious tools like these were not available, bad hackers would be writing their own tools anyway, and that would leave us good hackers unarmed and at a disadvantage. I think this quote by Marcus Ranum serves as a good bonus to malicious tooling too. I don't think it's always true, but it's something that kind of makes me smile a bit, especially given the increased reliance on open source, as well as the increased reliance on bug bounty programs. Offensive security is more of a co-evolutionary process. Tools like Metasploit make it easier for people to exploit stuff, which puts pressure on them to harden the systems. It may force an immune response from the community that you would not have probably gotten otherwise. Now to wrap up and summarize this presentation. We covered why offensive security matters, defined exploit and malicious tool development, learned about common open source resources and attack processes, and a few real-world examples of where open source tools have been used to create real-world malicious harm. If you notice, I did focus on how these open source tools created harm, and very specific harm, because one of the things that's very common within the security community, or some aspects of it, is like, oh, malicious tools are going to create harm. Yet a lot of times people don't cover the specific harm that they've caused. And that kind of bothers me a little bit as someone who's an open source advocate, because I've learned a lot from open source. I regularly use open source. A lot of companies regularly use open source. And it's a little bit misleading to be like, yeah, offensive tools are just harmful. And the idea of offensive tools just existing is going to inherently create harm without citing specific examples of it. And at this point, I hope these types of things are old news, but they're really not. Like every time I check Twitter, there's usually like some sort of thing just like bashing open source. But I think it's important to remember that these tools actually help us to protect networks. Also, I know it's very small, but if you want to see my references, they're at the bottom of each of the slides. And I don't have a QR code like the last speaker to my slide deck, but I can post a link to like a Google Drive or something on the YouTube comments. So thank you so much for attending my presentation, and to all the volunteers that made BSides Rochester possible, as well as my lovely friends who supported me throughout this journey. Does anyone have questions?
So with a lot of the IPSs, IDSs that are out there, the open source seems to kind of be these type of things with Metasploit and the payloads and the deliveries. Those things seem to be kind of feeding those and keeping them grow. So would you say that if they started to get to a point where they start controlling these type of things or locking them down or removing them, it might cause bigger issues for us to be able to detect these things being used in the wild? Because the code is different?
I'm not quite sure if I understand the question, but I do think it's imperative to upkeep these tools, especially for like IDS and IPS systems that are using like any form of like machine learning and all of that, because at least in my experience, harmful data has been used as a direct way to train these systems. And when like you're generating this harmful data, right, it's making, IDS and IPS machines much better. So I think, these tools in a way, like you suggested, like really do help, IDS and IPS systems. So, yeah. Any more questions?
So it seems like, so from all like the research that you have done, and you manage like a lot of degrees, and you're also
Calendaring. I really keep a very strict schedule. I really love academics. I love like my extracurricular activities. I love work as well. And being able to balance those things with my calendar is like if I don't have my calendar, like if I didn't have my calendar, I just would do nothing because I wouldn't remember what I have going on. So I just document everything that I have to do, and I set up like repeated events, and it just kind of keeps me on track. So I always have something to do. I'm never bored, and I also get everything done. Yeah.
So you were talking about open source and attack framework specifically. Do you think there's what is the relative difference in good versus bad of open source versus if all of these tools were put behind paywalls?
So it's interesting you say that because there's some really good like paywalled services and paywalled frameworks, and I don't know. And this is a question that's been repeatedly asked over and over and over again. And I think in instances where, like we saw where Metasploit just like decided to, push things into, like push unpatched, vulnerabilities, like just like into their program, like it really does raise the question of like, what is ethical here? What is just going to cause more harm than good? And I really don't know, and I don't think we'll ever know, because I don't think there are great metrics to, analyze this. And a focus of this talk was like trying to find very specific use cases of where a specific malicious tool was 100% proven to have harmed a system. And that's often very hard to do. When you see like news reports and stuff, every time a hack occurs, they often will never directly call out a tool. And when they do, it's usually something of, oh, this might have been used, this may have been used. And that annoys me because it's like, how do you know? How do you know what, APT40 is using? Like, it really frustrates me when, these broad generalizations are being used. And so I don't think there's going to be a way to tell unless the way that we analyze networks after hacks occurs, like drastically improves and we can put numbers on it. But I don't think there's a way currently.
So question and then follow-up question. First one, for the issues that you mentioned with Metasploit releasing the exploits too soon, do you know if this was in the free and open source version or their premium version?
I believe it was in the free and open source version.
And so with these tools having the effects that you said, what are your personal thoughts on the commercialization and regulation of these tools at a premium level aimed at corporations and government entities? And should those same capabilities be extended to the civilian population in the open source community?
I'm not entirely sure, and because I feel like it depends on the tool itself, and then how the tool is also released to the public. I think there's a lot of concerns around that, like that are valid, especially like when you talk about like government tools or like I feel like that could do like a lot of harm really fast. So I think it would be more tool specific. I will say though, as someone who's worked for corporations, I like to have more knowledge of what type of attacks and what type of harm could be caused, and so more knowledge in my experience is always better. So I would like to know, but I'm sure other people with malicious intent would also like to know. So for ideological reasons, I like GPLv3. However, if you have different goals that are not driven by, beliefs and stuff, you'll probably want like an MIT license or GPLv2. There's a lot of great licenses. I know a lot of people like the Apache licenses as well because they want corporations to adopt their software. For me, I'm very ideologically driven. Can you please repeat your question louder? No, it really frustrates me with this idea of like a corporation can take my work and then like not add on to it. I think the way that, science and innovation happens is by people sharing and building on top of each other. And so what I'm trying to do is to literally just force the innovation. I don't care if other people are making money. Like my blog, for example, you can take any content you want off my blog and not even cite me. I don't care. But what I do require is that you also have all that content also be open. I want people to add and build and innovate. I don't care about the money. I mean, I like money, but that's not what I'm going for. I want innovation to be consistent. I want to make the world a better place. And the whole idea of like, we're going to have, our program and then our company is just going to take it and, do whatever with it and never, advance the community forward is annoying. Any more questions?
Typically use open source software. Do you use anything outside of NMAP and MSF console, or those are the two main? Like, I'm just kind of assuming that's why I've mainly heard from like students, teachers, coworkers, everything.
Almost everything I use throughout my entire career and education has been open source. Like almost everything. It is very, very rare. I mean, there's times where like I'll use like a corporate license of a product, right? But like the core, like a Burp Suite, that's a great example. Like there's that's a thing, but like the core product itself is almost always open source. And the times where it hasn't been open source, it's because I've been developing something that is proprietary. But again, while I'm developing, I'm also using open source tools to do the development as well. You're done?
Congratulations on being one of the rare speakers that completes in a timely manner.
I rehearsed a lot and I'm very nervous, so I spoke a lot faster than I should have.